At 6:14 in the morning on November 11th, the sleet was coming down in Tulsa. The kind of sleet you get when winter has already decided what it wants to do. But the calendar hasn't caught up yet. The corrugated steel roof of Brennan Aviation's executive hangar took the hits like it had been built for exactly that purpose, which it had. Outside, the airfield lights cut weak yellow holes in the dark. Inside, the place smelled the way private jet hangars always smell. Jet fuel, polished metal, leather conditioner, and something faintly sweet that came from the fluid the floor crews used to keep the concrete shining. Calvin Foster pushed the wide-head industrial mop in slow, even arcs. He had been doing this for 6 years now. He was 52 years old, 6'2", built the way men get built when they have spent decades doing physical work without ever being paid much for it. His hair was cut close to the scalp, salt and pepper at the temples. His hands moved on the mop handle the way a man's hands move when he has stopped thinking about what they're doing. A $68 million Gulfstream G700 sat in the center of the bay, white as cake frosting, its wings catching the overhead light. The jet had landed at 3 in the morning, ferried in from Teterboro for an 11 a.m. departure to Dallas. Calvin had been on the floor for 2 hours already. He worked alone. The early shift always belonged to him because he had asked for it. The early shift meant he could finish in time to drive his daughter to school instead of putting her on a bus. The early shift meant he didn't have to share the radio with anyone who would put on country music he couldn't stand. He listened to nothing. The hum of the building was enough. His daughter Imani sat in the break room at the far end of the hangar, her 14-year-old shoulders hunched over a borrowed laptop, headphones in, doing a biology homework on a Veterans Day school holiday because her father had to work and there was nowhere else for her to be. Through the break room's narrow window, Calvin could see the back of her head, the careful Bantu knots she had done herself 2 days earlier, the small gold studs in her ears that had been a 10th birthday present from her mother. Cheryl had bought those earrings on a Tuesday. Calvin still remembered which Tuesday. He moved the mop another arc. The water in the bucket was getting cold. In the locker against the east wall behind a folded windbreaker and a thermos he no longer used, Calvin kept a small frame photograph face down. It had been face down for nearly 15 years. The picture showed a younger man in a flight suit standing next to an F-14 Tomcat on the deck of the USS Enterprise. Sun coming down hard from a sky over the Persian Gulf. The man's face was turned away from the camera. His helmet was tucked under his arm. You couldn't see his eyes. Calvin had not looked at the photograph in 3 years. He could not have said precisely why he kept it. Maybe because his mother had given him the frame, and his mother was gone now too. And throwing away the frame would have been throwing away something he wasn't ready to throw away. Maybe because there were things you carried because you couldn't put them down, even when you wanted to. He pushed the mop past the Gulfstream's nose. The right hand on the handle had a scar across the knuckles. Faded now. A thin, pale line that ran from the base of the index finger across the back of the hand. 22 years old in a wardroom on a carrier deck, a piece of shrapnel from a deck handling accident. He'd needed 9 stitches. He had not told his mother. A few feet away, a single thin tan line on his left ring finger. He had taken the wedding ring off the morning of Cheryl's funeral and put it in the small wooden box on his dresser. He had not put it back on. He had not taken it off either. The line on his finger had faded but never disappeared. Through the break room window, Imani looked up and waved a hand at him without taking her headphones out. He raised his chin in answer. She went back to her textbook. If you've ever had to swallow what you really were so the people you love wouldn't have to carry it with you, this is your story. Stay with us. You'll want to see how this one ends. Calvin's days were arranged the way a man arranges a small room when he has very little furniture but wants what he has to be in the right place. There was the alarm at 4:45, the shower, the same grey windbreaker, the thermos of coffee that he didn't drink at home, because Cheryl had made the coffee in the morning, and after she died, Calvin had stopped making it. He brewed it at the hangar instead, in the breakroom, where it was someone else's coffee maker and someone else's smell. He packed Imani's lunch the night before. Turkey sandwich with the crusts left on, because she had told him at age 9 that cutting the crusts off was a thing for little kids. An apple, 2 granola bars, a small thermos of water. He still wrote her name on the brown bag in black marker, even though there was no chance anyone would mistake it for theirs. He drove her to Booker T. Washington Magnet School at 7:50 every morning. The drive was 32 minutes if traffic on the inner dispersal loop was kind. 38 if it wasn't. They listened to NPR mostly. Sometimes a gospel station Imani had introduced him to that played a lot of Mahalia Jackson on Sunday mornings, and weekday mornings too. They didn't talk much in the truck. They didn't need to. There was a particular kind of quiet that came from being two people who had survived the same loss and didn't have to explain it to each other. After he dropped her off, he drove back to the hangar and worked his second shift, which ran from 9 to 1. Then he went home, ate something, slept for 2 hours if he could, and was back at the school at 5:15 to pick her up from robotics club. They went home. He cooked dinner. Always something simple. Always something Cheryl would have approved of. Never anything fancy. They ate at the kitchen table. They did not eat in front of the television. That was a rule Cheryl had made, and Calvin had kept. On weekends, Imani had her own life. She had a friend named Adia, whose mother taught at the magnet school, and who let Imani come over for sleepovers without asking too many questions. She volunteered at the community center on the north side. She read books, she studied. She had a small notebook full of equations she'd worked out for fun, the way other kids her age made playlists. Calvin had not dated since Cheryl died. He had not considered dating. The thought was not painful so much as foreign, the way a man might consider learning Mandarin in his 60s and find he simply did not have the time or the inclination. Cheryl had been 38 when she died. Healthy by any measure that anyone had bothered to measure. She had complained of feeling tired for about 3 weeks. She had made an appointment with her doctor for the following Monday. On Tuesday morning, she was making coffee at 6:23 a.m. And at 6:27, she was on the kitchen floor. And at 6:29, Calvin was on the phone with a 911 operator who told him to do chest compressions. And at 6:54, the paramedics confirmed what Calvin had already known the moment her body went still under his hands. Undiagnosed cardiomyopathy. The kind of thing the autopsy report described in the careful neutral language of a system that had not failed her, but had not seen her either. Imani had been 10. She had been at a sleepover at Adia's house. Calvin had driven over to pick her up himself, in the truck, alone. And he had told her in the front seat in the driveway because he could not figure out how to make her walk into the house and find out from a stranger. She had not cried right away. She had asked if he was sure. And then she had cried hard the way only children cry with her whole body. And Calvin had held her in the truck for 45 minutes while the engine ran and the heat poured out of the vents and the morning crept up around them. That was 4 years ago. He had left a position at Naval Air Station Oceana in 2011 to come home and take care of his mother through Alzheimer's. His mother had passed in 2018. By then, Cheryl was already gone too, and Imani was 11. And the window for any kind of return to the kind of work he'd once done had closed so completely that it no longer felt like a window at all. It felt like a wall. He had not been bitter about it. Bitterness was a luxury Calvin had never been able to afford. He had been raised in North Tulsa by a mother who had worked 3 jobs to put him through community college, then through Norfolk State on scholarship, and then to her astonishment and quite fierce pride through officer candidate school. His mother had not raised him to be bitter. She had raised him to be useful. So he had become useful in the only ways available to him. He kept a hangar floor clean. He raised a daughter. He did not look back, because looking back was a thing Calvin had decided somewhere in the long winter after Cheryl died that he simply was not going to do. The hangar crew at Brennan Aviation tolerated him without seeing him. The mechanics nodded when they walked past. The flight crews, mostly young men in pilots' jackets with company logos on the breast, did not nod. They walked around him the way you walk around a piece of equipment. The only person at Brennan who ever called him by name was Reggie Pruitt. Reggie was the night security guard, 68 years old. A black man from Mississippi who had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat medic and had been working the graveyard shift at the hangar for 9 years. Reggie called him Calvin. He called him Mani Missimani. He brought her hard candies from a tin he kept in his guard booth. That was about the size of Calvin Foster's social world. He liked it that way. Or he had told himself he did. Often enough that the difference had stopped mattering. At 7:42 a.m., the side door of the hangar opened on a gust of cold air, and Sterling Brennan walked in. Calvin saw him before he heard him. Sterling moved the way men with money move, not quickly, not slowly, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never in his adult life arrived anywhere without being expected. He was 41, 6 feet tall, in a navy pea coat over a charcoal suit. His hair was sandy brown with the kind of cut that cost $300. He had recently been divorced from his second wife, a fact the local society pages had covered with more enthusiasm than the divorce itself probably deserved. 2 associates flanked him. Both men were in their 30s, both in suits, both with the studious blankness of people whose job it was to agree with Sterling Brennan in small, useful ways throughout the course of a working day. Behind them came the documentary crew, a director with a clipboard, a sound technician trailing a boom, 2 camera operators with shoulder rigs. They were filming a day-in-the-life promotional piece for the corporate website. It was meant to support an upcoming IPO scheduled to begin its roadshow the following Monday. Sterling had been planning the IPO for 18 months. He was, the local financial press had reported, very personally invested in its success. Sterling Brennan was a 3rd-generation aviation man. His grandfather Walter Brennan had founded Brennan Aviation in 1958 with 2 surplus DC-3s and a contract to fly mail between Tulsa and Oklahoma City. His father, Walter Brennan Jr., had grown the company into a regional charter operation through the 70s and 80s. Sterling had inherited the corner office in 2014 at age 29, after his father's heart attack on a duck hunting trip in Arkansas. He had spent the intervening years acquiring a Stanford MBA, 2 ex-wives, 3 Aspen condominiums, and 14 months ago a private pilot's license. The pilot's license was a sore spot. It had taken him longer than he had publicly admitted. The flight school he'd used was partially owned by his family, which had not gone unnoticed in the small gossipy world of Tulsa aviation. He was sensitive about the subject. He talked about it often, which was anyone who knew him well could have told you exactly how you could tell. The documentary director gestured Sterling toward the Gulfstream's nose. The light from the high windows was beautiful at that hour. Sterling positioned himself, smiled, said something that one of his associates laughed at. The cameras rolled. Calvin pushed the mop another 6 feet and was now within the camera's line of sight, just beyond Sterling's left shoulder. Sterling glanced over without turning his head, registered Calvin in his peripheral vision, and waved him out of frame with a small backward flick of his hand. The gesture took less than a second. He did not break eye contact with the camera. Calvin lifted the mop from the floor, turned the bucket, and walked it 20 feet to the side without expression. He had been waved out of frame before, by Sterling and by other men who looked like Sterling. The gesture was not personal because Calvin was not personal. He was a piece of background. He understood this. It had stopped meaning anything to him a long time ago. In the breakroom, Imani had taken her headphones off. She had seen the wave, she had seen the cameras, she had seen the small instant compliance of her father's body, the way he had moved without protest, without comment, and this was what bothered her, even a flick of expression on his face. She was 14 years old, and there were things she was just beginning to understand about the world her father moved through, things he had not told her, things she suspected he had been deliberately not telling her for years. She pushed her chair back and stood at the break room window with her juice box in her hand and watched the documentary crew set up for the next shot. Sterling was speaking to the camera now, gesturing at the Gulfstream, his voice carrying across the bay in confident, well-rehearsed phrases about the soul of American aviation and the pride of the Brennan family legacy. Imani drank her juice and watched. The juice was warm. She had forgotten about it. The fuel flow warning came up on the diagnostic screen at 9:17 a.m. The chief mechanic, a man named Vince Halloran, who had been with Brennan Aviation for 19 years and who had a daughter Imani's age, was the one who saw it first. He frowned, ran the diagnostic again, frowned harder. He called over Pete Kominski, the contracted ferry pilot scheduled to take the Gulfstream to Dallas. Pete Kominski was 36 years old, ex-corporate, very experienced and very careful. He had a wife, 2 children, and a mortgage on a house in Broken Arrow. He looked at the diagnostic, looked at Vince, looked at the diagnostic again, and shook his head. He told Vince in the flat practice voice that pilots use when they're about to disappoint someone with a great deal of money that he was not flying the aircraft until the warning was cleared and a full inspection was done on the left engine. This was a problem. Sterling Brennan needed the Gulfstream in Dallas by 1:30 p.m. for a press conference connected to a regional partnership announcement that had been arranged with the kind of lead time these things require. Cancelling was not an option. Chartering an alternate was in theory an option, but it would mean appearing on his own corporate hangar floor in a competitor's aircraft on the day his documentary was being filmed. And that would have been the kind of optics his communications team was paid to prevent. He came over to the Gulfstream with his executive assistant, a woman named Brittany, who carried 2 phones and looked perpetually exhausted. The documentary crew followed at a discreet distance, still filming. Sterling spoke with Vince. Vince explained the situation. Sterling spoke with Pete. Pete repeated what he had told Vince. Sterling was charming about it for the first 30 seconds and noticeably less charming after that. The tendons in his neck were beginning to show. Calvin had been emptying a trash bin near the avionics workstation. He had heard everything. He had not intended to say anything. In 19 years of post-service life, he had not once volunteered a technical opinion in a hangar where he was paid to clean. But the symptom Vince was describing was familiar to him, in a way that was difficult to ignore. He walked over to where Vince was standing, set the trash bag down, and said quietly that he might have an idea. Vince looked at him. Vince had always been decent to Calvin. He nodded for him to go on. Calvin described in the careful, deferential voice he had spent 15 years training himself into that the symptom pattern matched a known software handshake glitch on that engine model. A thing he had read about, he said vaguely in a trade magazine. He recommended a specific 2-step diagnostic reset that would, if it was the glitch, clear the warning within 4 minutes. If it wasn't the glitch, the warning would persist, and they would know the engine had a real problem. Vince listened. Vince was about to say something. Calvin saw it on his face when Sterling Brennan's voice came across the bay. Sterling had been watching the exchange from 20 feet away. His associates had been watching too. The documentary crew, sensing something, had repositioned. Sterling walked over with a smile on his face that was not really a smile. He stopped beside Calvin and asked in a voice pitched for the camera what exactly the cleaning staff was contributing to the conversation. Vince started to say something. Sterling held up a hand and cut him off. He turned to Calvin. He looked Calvin up and down slowly with the deliberate condescension of a man who has decided to use another man as a prop. He said something about how nice it was to see initiative from the floor crew. But maybe Calvin should stick to his mop and let the experts handle the aircraft. He said it loud enough for the documentary microphones to pick it up. The two associates laughed in the soft, dutiful way of men paid to laugh at the right moments. Calvin did not respond. He nodded once, picked up his trash bag, and turned to walk away. Sterling was not finished. Whether he had planned what came next or whether it arrived in his head as an improvisation, no one would ever be sure. He reached into the inner pocket of his pea coat and pulled out the small black ignition fob for the Gulfstream's avionics. A key the size of a USB stick that Sterling carried as a kind of personal souvenir, even though he did not, strictly speaking, have any operational reason to carry it. He held the fob up to the camera. He smiled wider. He said that if Calvin was such an aviation expert, maybe he'd like to fly this. And then he tossed the fob across the 4 feet of polished concrete between them. Calvin's left hand came up and caught it without his consciously deciding to. 22 years of muscle memory does not ask permission. He held the fob in his open palm for a moment, looked at it, and then walked over to the workbench beside the Gulfstream's left wing and set it down carefully. The way you set down something fragile. He didn't look at Sterling. He picked up the trash bag. He walked toward the side door of the hangar. The documentary cameras kept rolling. In the breakroom, Imani had her hands flat against the window glass. The drive home that night was the longest of Imani Foster's life. And it was only 38 minutes. Calvin picked her up from robotics club at 5:15 the way he always did. He asked her how the meeting had gone. She told him fine. He nodded. He turned on NPR. They drove. He had not mentioned what had happened in the hangar. She had not mentioned that she had seen it. The silence between them was the same silence as every other evening, except that tonight it was not the same at all, and they both knew it. Imani sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the strip malls along Memorial Drive going past in their familiar smear of neon. She thought about her father catching the fob without looking. She thought about how his hand had moved, not flinched, not jerked, but moved. The way a man's hand moves when it has been catching things out of the air for a very long time. She thought about the photograph in his locker. She had seen the photograph once 3 years ago when she had come to the hangar with him on a Saturday because Adia's mother had been sick and there was nowhere else for her to go. She had been 11. She had wandered to the locker while Calvin was in the bathroom, opened it without permission because she was 11, and that was what 11-year-olds did. And she had seen the photograph face down on the top shelf. She had picked it up. She had seen the F-14 and the man in the flight suit and the back of his head. And she had known with the certainty of a child looking at her own father from an unfamiliar angle that the man in the picture was him. She had put the photograph back face down. She had closed the locker. She had not asked. Now she was 14 and she was going to ask. They got home at 6:02. Calvin made dinner, chicken thighs with rice and steamed broccoli, the same Tuesday dinner he had made every week for 4 years. They ate at the kitchen table. He asked her about her biology test on Thursday. She answered. He asked her about her scholarship interview at Embry-Riddle, which was 9 days away, and she gave him the same careful, hopeful answer she had been giving him for 2 months. She waited until they had cleared the plates. Then she sat back down across from him and said it. She asked him why he kept the photograph in his locker. Calvin had been wiping down the counter. His hand stopped moving. He did not turn around. He said finally that it was just something his mother had given him. Imani sat very still. She told him she had seen it. She told him she had seen him today with the man and the camera. And she told him that she was old enough now to know what she was looking at, and she wanted him to tell her the truth. Calvin set the dish rag down on the counter. He turned and looked at his daughter. And for the first time that she could remember, she saw him struggle to find words. He told her in the half answer he had been giving for years that he had served in the Navy a long time ago, that he had been a pilot, that it had been a different life. and it was over. And there was no use to bringing it back up. It was the first time in her life that Imani Foster had not believed her father. She did not say so. She nodded. She told him she had homework. She went to her room and closed the door. She lay on her bed for a while in the dark with her phone face down on her chest. She thought about her mother. She thought about the way her father had said it was over. Not the way you say something that's actually over, but the way you say something you have not allowed yourself to look at in so long that it might as well be. She picked up her phone. She opened a search browser. She typed her father's full name, Calvin James Foster, and after that, Navy pilot. There were 6 pages of results. Most were unrelated, but on the 3rd page, halfway down, there was a link to an archived issue of Naval Aviation News from October 2007. She clicked it. The article loaded. There was a photograph at the top. Black and white. Low resolution, but clear enough. It showed 3 naval aviators standing on a flight deck in flight suits, helmets under their arms. The man in the middle was her father. He was 33 years old in the picture. He was smiling. She had never in her entire life seen him smile like that. The caption read, Lieutenant Commander C. Foster, Top Gun instructor with 2 of his graduating cadre, NAS Fallon, 2007. Imani sat up on the bed. She read the article. She read it 3 times. Her father had been a Top Gun instructor. Her father had logged 437 carrier traps over a 14-year naval career. Her father had received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Twice. Once for actions over Iraq in 2003, and once the article noted obliquely for actions during a non-combat training emergency in 2009. Her father had never told her any of this. Her father had been pushing a mop in a hangar in Tulsa for 6 years, while a man like Sterling Brennan threw a key fob at his chest and laughed at him on camera. She put the phone down. She sat on the floor of her bedroom in the dark with her back against the side of the bed for a very long time. She did not cry. She had cried about her mother. She did not cry about this. What she felt was bigger than crying. What she felt was the kind of slow, patient anger that adults feel. The anger of a person who has finally understood the size of something that had been hidden in plain sight for as long as she could remember. It was almost 2 in the morning when she finally got into bed. She did not sleep. Imani was waiting in the hangar parking lot at 6:05 the next morning when Reggie Pruitt came out of the security booth at the end of his shift. Calvin had gone inside 10 minutes earlier. Imani had told him she wanted to talk to Reggie about a school project on veterans, which was a lie, and which Calvin had accepted because Calvin was, Imani had noted with a small, sharp pang of guilt, a man who trusted his daughter. Reggie was 68. He walked with a slight limp that had nothing to do with combat. He had fallen off a ladder in 1994, cleaning out his gutters. But he carried his shoulders the way men who have been soldiers carry their shoulders. And he wore his security uniform the way men who have once worn other uniforms wear their later ones. He saw Imani waiting by his car, and his face changed. He asked her if her father knew she was out here. She said he didn't. He looked at her for a moment. Then he leaned against the side of his Buick the way Reggie leaned against things with his arms folded, and he asked her what she wanted to know. She showed him the article on her phone. Reggie looked at it. He took the phone out of her hand and held it close to his face. His eyes weren't what they used to be. And he read the caption and looked at the photograph and was quiet for a long moment. He handed the phone back to her. He told her she was old enough. He told her then what her father had not. He told her that Calvin Foster had flown 38 combat sorties over Iraq in the opening weeks of Operation Iraqi Freedom in March and April of 2003. He told her that Calvin had been assigned to VFA 211 Fighter Attack Squadron off the USS Enterprise. He told her that Calvin had flown low-altitude, close air support missions in conditions that most pilots refused. That he had been decorated for actions in support of Marine ground forces near An-Nasiriyah in late March, and that he had been recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross, by his commanding officer in language that Reggie said he had personally seen excerpted in a Navy Times piece in 2004. Reggie told her about the second medal too. In the spring of 2009, Calvin had been a senior instructor at the Top Gun program, the United States Navy Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program, headquartered at Naval Air Station Fallon in Nevada. He had been on a routine training detachment at Naval Air Station Oceana, flying with a young student pilot named Daniel Alcorn, 23 years old, on a training exercise off the coast of Virginia Beach. 40 miles off the coast, both engines on Daniel Alcorn's FA-18 had flamed out within 90 seconds of each other. A catastrophic, almost statistically impossible double failure caused by contaminated fuel. Calvin had been in the lead aircraft. He had talked Daniel Alcorn through the longest 12 minutes of either of their lives. He had coordinated with the carrier's air boss, with Norfolk Approach, with the Coast Guard. He had stayed on Daniel's wing the entire descent, refusing to peel off even when his own fuel state began to degrade. He had walked Daniel through a dead stick ditch that was so close to impossible that the after-action report had described the outcome as exceptional airmanship, resulting in 0 loss of life and recovery of pilot in good health within 19 minutes of water entry. Calvin had received the second Distinguished Flying Cross for that. Daniel Alcorn had walked out of the recovery hospital 3 days later. He had finished his training. He had stayed in the Navy for 6 more years and then transitioned to commercial aviation. He was now a captain at Delta Airlines and one of the most respected aviation safety consultants in the country. He had named his first son Calvin. Imani stood in the parking lot in the cold November morning and listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. When Reggie was done, she asked him the question she had been trying to ask all night, which was why her father had never spoken of any of this to her. Reggie looked at her for a long moment. He told her that some men learn to be quiet so the people they love don't have to carry what they carry. He told her that her father had walked out of a Top Gun instructor billet in 2011 because his mother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and there was nobody else, and that her father had given up the only thing he had ever loved doing besides being her father, and that he had done it without complaining, and without explaining, and without ever once in 9 years of working night shifts together at Brennan Aviation mentioning a single piece of his prior life to Reggie. Reggie had figured most of it out on his own. He had been Army, not Navy, but he had served. He knew what the carriage of a former officer looked like. He knew what kind of hands closed around a tool the way Calvin Foster's hands closed around a tool. He had not asked Calvin to confirm anything. They had developed an unspoken understanding over the years. Calvin's silence respected. Reggie's recognition kept private. Imani thanked him. Her voice was very small. Reggie put his hand on her shoulder. His hand was the size of a baseball mitt, and it shook a little the way old men's hands shake. He told her something he had not planned to tell her, but found himself saying anyway. He told her that her father loved her more than he had ever loved being a pilot, and that the silence had not been about pride. It had been about not wanting her childhood to be shaped by a job he could no longer do. Imani got back in the truck. Calvin was inside the hangar already at work. She watched him through the bay window for a long time. The way he moved the mop. The way his shoulders carried the slow heaviness of a man who had been on his feet for 2 hours already. She turned the heat up in the cab. She put her head against the window. She did not go inside. She had a great deal to think about. Brennan Aviation's communications director, a young woman named Haley Dunmore, who had been hired 6 months earlier from a Dallas PR firm, uploaded the Day in the Life promotional video to the company's corporate YouTube channel and LinkedIn page on Wednesday afternoon at 4:30 p.m. The video was 4 minutes and 12 seconds long. It featured Sterling Brennan walking through the hangar, talking about heritage and innovation and the future of private aviation in the central United States. It had been edited carefully. The fob incident had been cut, of course. Haley had personally flagged that footage as unusable. What Haley had not realized was that one of the camera operators, a freelancer named Marcus Quigley, had kept his own copy of the unedited B-roll on a personal hard drive. Marcus Quigley was 31 years old, a former Air Force enlisted aircraft mechanic himself, and he had not liked what he had seen Sterling Brennan do that Tuesday morning. He had not said anything at the time because he had needed the gig. But he had kept the footage. On Wednesday evening, Marcus Quigley uploaded a 6-second clip. Sterling tossing the fob, Calvin catching it without flinching, Sterling smirked to camera. Calvin walking away with his trash bag to a Reddit forum called r/aviation. He titled the post, CEO mocks janitor in private jet hangar. Watch the catch. By Thursday morning, the post had 4.7 million views. Reddit's r/aviation is a particular kind of online community. Its membership skews heavily toward current and former military aviators, commercial pilots, aircraft mechanics, ATC controllers, people who have spent their adult lives in some corner of the aviation industry. They are as a rule deeply contemptuous of bullies, deeply respectful of competence, and very, very good at finding things out. By Thursday afternoon, the top comment on the original post with 41,000 upvotes was a side-by-side image. On the left, a frame from the hangar footage of Calvin's face. On the right, the 2007 Naval Aviation News photograph of Lieutenant Commander C. Foster at NAS Fallon. The two images were unmistakably the same man. The commenter, who went by the handle hookrunner_84, had written, "That's Cal Foster. Top Gun instructor, 2-time DFC. He's the guy who saved Sabre Alcorn off Virginia Beach in 2009. You're telling me this CEO threw a key fob at that man and called him a janitor?" The thread exploded. By Thursday evening, the story had been picked up by Task and Purpose Stars and Stripes, the Tulsa World, and a Defense Affairs blog with a substantial mainstream readership. By Friday morning, 3 major networks had reached out to Brennan Aviation's media office for comment. The local NBC affiliate sent a van to the hangar parking lot at 7 a.m. The story had a particular shape that made it irresistible. A CEO with an IPO scheduled to launch on Monday, a documentary crew, a mock janitor, a black widower raising a daughter alone in Oklahoma, a decorated naval aviator with 2 distinguished flying crosses hidden in plain sight for 15 years, a daughter on the verge of her own scholarship interview at one of the country's premier aviation universities. It was the kind of story that wrote itself. Sterling Brennan was in Dallas when the story broke. He was on the phone with his communications team within 12 minutes of the first network call. By Friday afternoon, his PR firm had drafted 3 different versions of a public apology and 1 version of a corporate denial. None of them were going to work, and the smarter people in the room knew it, though no one said so out loud where Sterling could hear. The IPO roadshow was scheduled to begin in Tulsa on Monday morning. Major institutional investors had begun returning calls from Brennan Aviation's lead bank with questions about leadership, optics, and reputational exposure. The bank's IPO team had begun in language so careful that you needed to know how to translate it, suggesting a delay. Sterling Brennan was not going to take a delay. Sterling Brennan was going to fight. He just hadn't yet figured out how. In Tulsa, in a small frame house in North Tulsa, with a peeling porch railing and a snow shovel leaning against the storm door, Calvin Foster was standing in his kitchen at 5:42 a.m. on Friday morning, packing his daughter's lunch. His phone had been ringing for 2 hours. He had turned it off. Imani had told him about the article she had found. She had told him about her conversation with Reggie. She had told him in the careful, deliberate voice of a 14-year-old who has decided to act like the adult in the room that she loved him very much, and that she was not angry, and that she just wanted to understand. Calvin had listened. He had not said much. He had told her he would talk to her about it that night. He had not yet looked at the internet. He was about to. It was 2:14 p.m. on Friday afternoon, and Calvin was on the hangar floor with his bucket and his mop when the black SUV pulled into the visitor lot. He did not see it pull in. He was on the far side of the bay finishing the polish strip along the wall under the avionics counter. He had spent the morning trying not to think about his phone, which he had turned back on at 9 a.m., and which had since received 47 text messages, 11 voicemails, and 2 interview requests from organizations he had never heard of. He had read none of them. He had put the phone in his locker. He had gone back to work. The man who got out of the SUV was in his late 30s. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a white shirt with no tie, and he was holding 2 coffee cups and a cardboard tray. He walked across the parking lot to the hangar's side door, opened it, and stepped inside. He stood for a moment by the door looking around. He had the bearing of a man who was used to being in hangars, but was not sure where this particular hangar's protocol stood. He spotted Vince Halloran near the maintenance station and walked over. They spoke for 30 seconds. Vince pointed. The man in the suit turned and walked across the polished concrete to the far side of the bay. He stopped 6 feet from Calvin. He waited. Calvin straightened up. He had felt the man approach. He turned around. The man in the suit set the coffee tray down on a nearby workbench. He looked at Calvin the way you look at someone you have not seen in a long time but have thought about almost every day. He did not smile. His face was very still. He said only one word. He said Saber. Calvin's hand let go of the mop handle. The handle hit the concrete with a sound that seemed in the moment much louder than it actually was. He had not heard that name in 15 years. Saber had been his radio call sign in the Navy. Saber had been what his students called him. Saber had been what Daniel Alcorn had called him on the morning of April 12, 2009, on a frequency that had been recorded by a flight test Delta recorder, and that Calvin had never listened back to, and never would. The man in the suit was Daniel Alcorn. He was 38 years old now. He was a Delta Airlines captain. He flew the Airbus A33, long haul out of Atlanta. He had a wife and 2 children. The older of his 2 sons was named Calvin James Alcorn, and Daniel had never told the boy why. Daniel had flown into Tulsa that morning on his own dime on a 5:45 a.m. flight from Hartsfield-Jackson. He had not told Calvin he was coming. He had not been sure until he was on the plane that he was actually going to do this. He had been a Reddit user for years. He had seen the post on Wednesday night. He had recognized Calvin in the first second. He had recognized the catch too, the small, casual 2-decade-old reflex of a man who had pulled 100 objects out of the air on the deck of a moving ship in his 20s. Daniel had spent Wednesday night calling old Navy friends. He had called Captain Lou Ferraro, who had been Calvin's CO at NAS Fallon. He had called Master Chief Aviator Tony Reyes, who had served with Calvin at Oceana. He had called 3 other former students from Calvin's Top Gun cohort pilots now scattered across the Navy Reserves, Lockheed Martin's training division, and one in the airline industry like Daniel himself. By Friday morning, an informal group text had gathered 17 people. Most of them had not seen Calvin in a decade or longer. None of them had known where he was. They knew now. Calvin sat down on the empty stool next to the workbench. His knees had not given out exactly, but they had decided very quickly that sitting was a better option than standing. He looked up at Daniel Alcorn. Daniel sat down on the stool across from him. He pushed one of the coffee cups toward Calvin. His hand was shaking slightly, and he was not the kind of man whose hand normally shook. He told Calvin that the entire community knew now. He told Calvin that the Naval Aviation Hall of Fame had been trying to locate him for an induction nomination since 2021, and that the nomination had been shelved each year because no one could find a current address, and that the nomination committee had reopened the file on Thursday morning when the Reddit thread crossed 2 million views. He told Calvin that there were 17 people who wanted Calvin to know that they were sorry they had not stayed in better touch, and that they had loved him then, and that they loved him still. He told Calvin that his son's name was Calvin. Calvin Foster did not say anything for a very long time. Daniel Alcorn waited. Across the bay in the doorway of the break room, Imani Foster stood with her hand over her mouth and watched her father. The strongest man she had ever known. The man who had carried her through her mother's death without ever letting her see him break. Put his face in his hands and cry. It was the first time she had ever seen him cry. She had not seen him cry at her mother's funeral. She had not seen him cry through any of the hard years that came after. She did not move from the doorway. She let him have it. She understood somehow, even at 14, that this was a thing he needed to do without an audience, even though there was an audience. And that the kindest thing she could do was stay where she was and not interrupt. When he was done, he wiped his face with the heel of his hand. He looked up at Daniel. He picked up the coffee. He did not say Saber. He did not say thank you. He said very quietly, "How's your boy?" And Daniel Alcorn, captain at Delta Airlines, decorated naval aviator, husband, father, fully grown man of 38 years, sat on a stool in a hangar in Tulsa and cried too. By Saturday morning, Sterling Brennan's communications team had a plan. The plan, which had been hammered out in a 6-hour conference call that ran from 4 p.m. Friday to 10 p.m., consisted of 3 components. First, a publicly released apology video to be filmed by Sterling himself and posted to all corporate channels by Monday morning. Second, a $25,000 service excellence bonus check framed as a long overdue recognition of Calvin Foster's loyalty to the company. Third, a coordinated photo opportunity in which Sterling and Calvin would shake hands on the hangar floor in front of the same documentary crew that had filmed the original incident. And the new footage would be incorporated into a revised promotional package emphasizing the company's commitment to its employees. It was a bad plan. It was the kind of plan that was made by people who had spent their careers handling celebrity scandals and consumer product PR crises, and who had not yet absorbed the particular rules that govern a story involving a decorated military veteran and a wealthy white CEO who had publicly mocked him. Margaret Whitcomb knew this. Margaret Whitcomb was 76 years old. She had been the chair of Brennan Aviation's board of directors for 19 years. She had served on Walter Brennan Jr.'s board for the 11 years before that. She had known Sterling since he was 14, and she had voted in favor of his appointment as CEO in 2014 because his father had asked her to. And she had spent the 11 years since then privately regretting the decision and publicly defending it. Because that was what board chairs did when they had voted for the wrong man. She read the plan at 7 a.m. Saturday on her tablet, sitting at her kitchen table in her house off Riverside Drive with her second cup of coffee in front of her. She read it twice. She picked up her phone and called Sterling. She told him in language that was unmistakable that under no circumstances was he to send a check to Calvin Foster, that under no circumstances was he to attempt a photo opportunity, and that under no circumstances was he to release a public apology video without first sitting down in a room with Margaret and 3 of the other board members for a closed-door conversation about what was actually happening to the company. Sterling listened. Sterling thanked her for her concern. Sterling said he would consider her input. Sterling did not consider her input. At 11:15 a.m. Saturday, Sterling's chief of staff, a man named Jordan Kreitzer, who had been with Sterling for 6 years and whose primary professional skill was telling Sterling exactly what Sterling wanted to hear, drove to the hangar in a black Cadillac Escalade with a folder in his lap. Inside the folder was the $25,000 check, a printed statement for Calvin to read on camera, and a release form authorizing the use of his image. The documentary crew followed in a separate vehicle. Calvin had been told that morning by Vince Halloran that Sterling's representatives were coming to see him at noon. Vince had been told by Haley Dunmore in a conference call at 9 a.m. and had relayed the message to Calvin in the break room with an expression on his face that suggested Vince thought the entire idea was idiotic and was professionally obligated not to say so. Calvin had thanked Vince for the heads up. He had finished his coffee. He had gone back to work. When Jordan Kreitzer arrived with the folder and the cameras, Calvin met him in the break room. He did not stand up when Jordan walked in. He gestured for him to sit. Jordan Kreitzer launched into the prepared opening. He explained the gesture. He explained the bonus. He explained the pre-written statement which praised Brennan Aviation's commitment to its employees and described Calvin's valued contributions and Sterling's deep appreciation. Calvin took the folder. He read the statement. He read it once slowly. He folded it back up and set it on the break room table. He pushed the folder back across the table to Jordan Kreitzer. He told him in 3 short sentences that he was not going to read the statement. He was not going to accept the check. He was not going to appear on camera. Jordan Kreitzer began to explain why this was a mistake. He began to talk about narrative momentum and the importance of a public reconciliation. He began to suggest in carefully neutral language that there might be other professional opportunities for Calvin within the Brennan Aviation organization if Calvin chose to handle this gracefully. Calvin looked at him. He told Jordan Kreitzer that he was going to ask him to leave. Jordan Kreitzer left. The documentary crew who had been waiting outside the break room door packed up their gear in silence and drove away. That same evening at 6:47 p.m., the regional administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration's Southwest Region office in Fort Worth received an internal memo recommending the opening of a preliminary inquiry into the Brennan Aviation Gulfstream incident from the previous Tuesday. The memo cited concerns about the chain of pre-flight diagnostic decision-making and the inappropriate dismissal by Brennan Aviation's CEO of an employee's technical recommendation that had subsequently been validated by the contracted ferry pilot as the correct course of action. The inquiry was assigned a docket number. A formal letter of inquiry was prepared for Monday morning delivery. Sterling Brennan was at that moment at a private dinner in Dallas. He did not yet know about the inquiry. He was about to. The board met in emergency session on Sunday afternoon at 2 p.m. There were 9 members of the Brennan Aviation Board. 4 were members of the Brennan family by blood or marriage. 5 were independent directors. Margaret Whitcomb was the chair. The meeting was held at the company's downtown Tulsa offices in the same wood-paneled conference room where Sterling's grandfather had signed the company's first commercial contract 67 years earlier. Sterling was not invited. The meeting lasted 3 hours. The board reviewed the events of the past week. The board reviewed the FAA inquiry letter that had been received that morning by overnight courier. The board reviewed the IPO bank's revised assessment of the company's near-term valuation, which had decreased by an estimated 18% over the course of the previous 5 days. The board reviewed Haley Dunmore's resignation letter, which had been delivered by email on Saturday night. The board voted 7-2 to commission an independent operational review of Brennan Aviation's pilot competency standards, training procedures, and executive flight authorization protocols. The 2 dissenting votes were Sterling's 2 cousins who served on the board out of family obligation and who had not in 19 years voted against any motion supported by Sterling. The review was assigned to a Washington-based aviation consulting firm that specialized in regulatory compliance audits. The firm's lead investigator was a former FAA enforcement attorney named Patricia Voss. Patricia Voss arrived in Tulsa on Tuesday morning and began her work that afternoon. What she found over the following 10 days was not what anyone on the board had expected. The diagnostic incident with the Gulfstream had been correctly handled by everyone except Sterling. Vince Halloran's flagging of the warning had been textbook. Pete Kaminsky's refusal to fly had been textbook. The 2-step diagnostic reset that Calvin had recommended had been performed at 3 p.m. that Tuesday afternoon after Sterling had departed for Dallas in a chartered alternate and had cleared the warning within 4 minutes. Exactly as Calvin had predicted. The Gulfstream had been returned to service the following morning with no further issues. That part of the inquiry was straightforward. The other part was not. Patricia Voss requested Sterling Brennan's personal pilot logbook on the 3rd day of her review. The logbook was provided. She requested cross-referenced records from the family-owned flight school where Sterling had obtained his initial certification 14 months earlier. Those records were provided too, after a delay of 4 days and through the involvement of the board's outside counsel. The discrepancies were extensive. Sterling had logged 312 hours of pilot-in-command time in the period between his initial certification and the date of the inquiry. The flight school's records, however, indicated that approximately 87 of those hours had been logged during periods when the school's records showed no instructor present. And the aircraft Sterling had supposedly flown was on the dates in question undergoing maintenance or otherwise out of service. There were other irregularities. Several of Sterling's certification renewal entries had been signed off by an instructor who had not, according to FAA records, been current in his own instructor rating at the time of the sign-offs. 2 of Sterling's check rides, including the check ride that had qualified him to fly aircraft in the Gulfstream's category, had been administered by a designated pilot examiner, who the inquiry would later confirm had received personal financial consulting work from the Brennan family during the same calendar year. Patricia Voss filed her preliminary report on the 11th day of the review. The board read it on a Friday afternoon. Margaret Whitcomb, who had been chairing the board for 19 years and who had voted for Sterling's appointment in 2014, sat in the conference room with the report on the table in front of her and put her hand over her eyes for nearly a full minute before she said anything. Then she put the report down and made 2 phone calls. The first call was to the board's outside counsel asking him to begin drafting the language of a vote of no confidence. The second call was to Calvin Foster. She did not call from her office. She called from her kitchen on her personal cell phone on a Saturday morning at 8 a.m. She had gotten his number from Vince Halloran, who had gotten it from Reggie Pruitt, who had asked Calvin's permission first. She did not introduce herself with her title. She introduced herself by her name. She told him she would like to meet him for breakfast at the Coney Island Diner 3 blocks from the hangar. She told him she was not bringing lawyers. She told him she was not making a job offer or asking him to sign anything. She told him she just wanted to talk. Calvin agreed. They met at 9 o'clock the next morning. The Coney Island had been on Cincinnati Avenue since 1926. The booths were red vinyl cracked at the corners. The coffee was bad. The hash browns were good. Margaret Whitcomb was already in the back booth when Calvin arrived. She stood up to shake his hand. She was small, 5'4", with grey hair pinned in a low chignon, and the kind of plain wool coat that does not announce itself. Her hand was very firm. She told him she was not going to apologize on Sterling's behalf because she was not Sterling, and because his apology, if he ever offered one, was his to give. She told him that what had happened in the hangar had been wrong. She told him that she had read the file the inquiry had assembled on his service record, and that she had seen the photograph and had read the citations and had cried at her kitchen table the previous night, which she did not normally do. She told him that Walter Brennan, who had founded the company in 1958, would have shaken his hand. He would not have thrown a key fob at it. She told him that the board had decided that morning to remove Sterling from operational authority over the company's flight division within 30 days. The IPO had been delayed by 18 months. Major investors had withdrawn. The board would be conducting a search for a new president of flight operations. She did not offer him the position of president. She offered him something else. She offered him the position of Director of Pilot Standards and Training, with full authority over the company's Flight Academy program, a program that Brennan Aviation had been operating in a small underfunded form for 12 years, and that the board now intended to expand into a regional training center for the next generation of commercial and corporate pilots in the central United States. She told him that the program had been struggling. She told him that the position had been vacant for 7 months. She told him that they did not want a name to put on the org chart. They wanted a man who knew what he was doing, who would be respected by everyone in the building, and who would treat the work like the work mattered. She told him she could not think of anyone in the country more qualified. Calvin sat across from Margaret Whitcomb in the red vinyl booth at the Coney Island diner and did not say anything for a long moment. He had not expected this. He had not planned for it. He had told himself over the past week that the entire episode would pass, that the news would move on to other news, and that he would go back to mopping floors at a different hangar in some other corner of Tulsa as soon as the dust settled. He told Margaret Whitcomb he needed the weekend to think about it. Margaret Whitcomb said she had been hoping he would say that. She told him to take all the time he needed. She paid the check. She left. Calvin sat in the booth for another 20 minutes after she had gone. He drank his coffee. He looked out the window at Cincinnati Avenue. He thought about his mother. He thought about Cheryl. He thought about a long-ago hangar at NAS Fallon and the smell of jet exhaust on a desert morning. He thought about Imani. Imani's scholarship interview at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University was scheduled for 1 p.m. on Saturday at the school's regional admissions office in Daytona Beach, Florida. Embry-Riddle had flown her in for the day. Calvin had refused the offer of accommodations and had paid for his own coach ticket to fly down with her. The flight was at 6 a.m. Saturday morning out of Tulsa International. They got to the airport at 4:30. Imani was wearing the navy blue dress she had bought with her own money from a thrift store on Brookside with a white cardigan over it. Calvin was wearing his only suit, a charcoal three-piece that had once belonged to his father-in-law and that Cheryl had insisted on saving when her father had died. Imani had her presentation on a thumb drive in her purse. She had been working on it for 3 months. The topic was the history of African-American aviation pioneers in the United States military, from the Tuskegee Airmen to the present day. She had not in any draft mentioned her father. She had been worried before this week about whether she had the right to. Now she had updated the final slide. They flew. They landed at Daytona at 11:30. Calvin rented a car. He drove her to the campus. He parked in the visitor's lot. 4 hours before her interview was scheduled to begin, because Calvin Foster had not in 52 years of life ever been late to anything important, and he had decided long ago that he was not going to start now. Imani went into the building at 12:45. Calvin sat in the rental car in the parking lot. He sat there for 4 hours. It was 68 degrees outside. The sun came in through the windshield. He could see the palm trees along the edge of the lot moving slightly in the breeze coming off the Atlantic. Across the campus, a small Cessna 172 was running a touch-and-go pattern on the runway about half a mile away. Calvin watched the airplane. He had not been in the cockpit of an aircraft in 15 years. He thought about Sterling Brennan. He thought about Margaret Whitcomb. He thought about the position Margaret had offered him, and what it would mean to accept it, and what it would mean to refuse it. He thought about his mother. His mother had been a janitor too, at a public elementary school in North Tulsa, for 31 years. She had cleaned classrooms and bathrooms and cafeterias, and she had raised her son to believe that the work was honorable. And the work was. Calvin had never been ashamed of her work, and he had never been ashamed of his. But the work had not been the question. The question had been what happens when you are doing one kind of honorable work because you have stopped allowing yourself to do another kind of honorable work that you might also still be capable of doing. The question had been about whether his silence had been a gift to Imani or a failure of nerve. And Calvin had been telling himself one answer for 15 years, and was now wondering for the first time if the other answer might be closer to the truth. He thought about Cheryl. Cheryl had not ever in their 15 years of marriage told him to go back to flying. She had never pushed. She had supported his decision to leave Oceana when his mother got sick. She had supported his decision to stay home after his mother died. She had supported all the small accumulating decisions that had added up over time to a life that had gradually shrunk down to the size of the kitchen they shared, and the daughter they were raising, and the work he did to pay for both. But Cheryl had also, on the morning of her last birthday, 8 months before she died, looked at him across a breakfast table in their kitchen and said something that Calvin had never been able to forget. She had said, "Calvin, I don't think you remember anymore who you were before you were taking care of all of us." She had not said it as an accusation. She had said it the way she said things when she was worried about him. He had told her she was wrong. He had told her he was fine. She had looked at him for a long moment. She had reached across the table and put her hand over his. She had not said anything else. 8 months later, she was gone. And Calvin had spent the 4 years since then in a kind of careful, deliberate silence about his own life. Because he had told himself that what Imani needed from him was steadiness. And steadiness had meant sameness. And sameness had meant not changing anything ever. Because changing things was how people got hurt. He sat in the rental car in the Embry-Riddle parking lot and watched the Cessna run another touch and go. At 4:50, Imani came out of the admissions building. She was walking fast. She had her thumb drive clutched in one hand. Her cardigan was unbuttoned. When she got to the rental car, she got in the passenger seat and did not say anything for almost a full minute. Then she told him it had gone well. She told him the committee had liked her presentation. She told him they had asked her good questions and that she had answered them and that she had not even once lost her composure. She told him they had asked her at the very end who her hero in aviation was. She told him she had said Lieutenant Commander Calvin James Foster. She told him she had told them about him. Calvin sat in the driver's seat of the rental car in the parking lot at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and looked at his 14-year-old daughter in her second-hand navy dress. And he felt something in him that had been folded up and put away for 15 years begin slowly to unfold. They drove to the airport, they flew home. On the drive from Tulsa International to their house in North Tulsa on Interstate 44 with the wheat fields stretching out under the November moon to either side, Imani asked him what he had been thinking about all those hours in the parking lot. Calvin pulled the truck onto the shoulder of the highway. He turned the engine off. He sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. He told her he had been thinking about her mother. He told her he had been thinking about a question her mother had asked him 8 months before she died. He told her that he had decided sitting in that parking lot that he was going to take the job Margaret Whitcomb had offered him. He told her that he was sorry he had been silent for so long. He told her she had deserved to know who her father was. Imani did not say anything. She unbuckled her seatbelt. She slid across the bench seat. She put her arms around her father's shoulders. And she put her face against the side of his neck. And she held on. The truck sat on the shoulder of I-44 with its hazards flashing. Cars went past. The wind moved through the wheat fields. After a long time, Calvin started the engine again, and they drove the rest of the way home. The IPO Roadshow press conference proceeded as scheduled on Monday morning. Sterling Brennan had arrived at the Mayo Hotel in downtown Tulsa at 8 a.m. with a fresh haircut, a navy suit, and a prepared statement that his communications team had revised 7 times over the weekend. He had been told that Margaret Whitcomb would be joining him on stage as a show of board unity. He had not been told what Margaret Whitcomb intended to say. The press conference was held in the Crystal Ballroom on the 2nd floor. There were 62 seats. All of them were full. There were 9 cameras at the back of the room, including local affiliates and one national network that had flown a crew in from Chicago after the Reddit story crossed 12 million views over the weekend. Sterling stepped to the podium at 9:02. He greeted the room. He thanked everyone for coming. He began to read his prepared remarks. He'd been speaking for approximately 45 seconds and was just beginning the section about the company's commitment to its employees when Margaret Whitcomb stood up from her chair to his left and walked to the podium. She did not interrupt him with words. She simply walked over and stood beside him until he stopped speaking, which took him about 4 seconds longer than it should have, because Sterling did not at first understand what was happening. Margaret leaned into the microphone. She thanked Sterling for his remarks. She told the room she had a brief announcement to make on behalf of the board of directors of Brennan Aviation Group. She announced that effective immediately, Lieutenant Commander Calvin J. Foster, USN, retired former Top Gun instructor and two-time recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, had accepted the position of Director of Pilot Standards and Training for the company's Flight Academy program. She paused. She let the room absorb it. She continued. She announced that the board, after a thorough review of the company's flight operations, had elected to restructure the executive leadership of the flight division. Sterling Brennan would continue in his role as Chief Executive Officer for the immediate future, but operational authority over all flight-related divisions would be transitioned to a newly created Office of Flight Operations within the next 30 days. The IPO had been delayed by 18 months pending the completion of an ongoing operational review. The room had gone very quiet. Margaret thanked the press for their attention. She introduced Calvin Foster, who walked out from the side of the stage in a charcoal three-piece suit that his daughter had helped him pick out the night before. Standing at the back of the ballroom in a row that had been quietly reserved that morning by Margaret Whitcomb's assistant were 4 men in airline captain uniforms. Daniel Alcorn in his Delta uniform. Captain Lou Ferraro, retired Navy, currently flying for Southwest. Captain Maria Velez, Top Gun class of 2008, now a Czech airman at American. And Captain Tony Reyes, retired Master Chief Aviator, now a senior instructor at the Boeing 787 Simulator Center in Dallas. They stood. They did not say anything. They simply stood. Sterling Brennan stood at the podium beside Margaret Whitcomb and looked out at the room, and understood in a single fixed moment that the rest of his life was not going to look the way he had imagined it would look on the morning he had walked into the hangar and waved Calvin out of frame. Calvin walked to the podium. He shook Margaret's hand. He turned to face the room. He did not give a speech. He thanked the board for their confidence. He thanked the men standing at the back of the room without naming them. He said he was looking forward to the work. He stepped away from the microphone. He did not look at Sterling Brennan, not because he was avoiding him, because in that moment Sterling Brennan was no longer the most important person in the room. And Calvin had no need to make eye contact with him to confirm that fact. In the second row, in a navy dress and a white cardigan, Imani Foster sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched her father. She was crying. She was not trying to hide it. She did not need to hide it. There was no shame in it. It was, she would later think, the proudest moment of her life. The FAA inquiry concluded its preliminary phase 3 weeks after the press conference. The inquiry's findings were not made public in their entirety. What was made public was a brief letter dated December 8th, addressed to the Chief Operating Officer of Brennan Aviation Group, indicating that the FAA had determined sufficient cause to proceed to a formal enforcement action against one Sterling Walter Brennan III for falsification of pilot logbook entries, fraudulent certification renewals, and operation of category-rated aircraft without valid qualification. The enforcement action resulted in the suspension of Sterling's pilot's license pending a full hearing. The hearing was scheduled for the following March. Sterling's outside counsel, after reviewing the inquiry's findings, advised him in private that contesting the action was not a winning strategy. The pilot's license, the one he had been so proud of, the one he had earned through 14 months of expensive lessons, and the casual cooperation of a flight school his family partly owned, was the one thing of his that he had genuinely cared about. It was the one thing that had made him, in his own internal calculus, more than just a man who had inherited his father's company. Losing it broke something in him in a way that the loss of the IPO had not. He resigned as CEO of Brennan Aviation Group on a Friday afternoon in mid-December. The resignation was announced via a brief press release that described the change as a strategic transition reflecting the company's evolving leadership needs. He retained a non-voting honorary seat on the board, which had been negotiated by his outside counsel as the price of a quiet exit. Margaret Whitcomb signed the release. Sterling left the building that evening through the executive parking entrance. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He had ordered a private car. The car took him to his condominium in Midtown. He did not leave the condominium for 11 days. That same Friday evening in the janitorial wing on the south side of Brennan Aviation's main hangar, Calvin Foster was cleaning out his locker for the last time. He did it after hours. He had not made an announcement about it. He had simply waited until the night shift took over and the hangar had quieted down. And then he had walked back to the locker room with an empty cardboard box and begun the small task of removing the artifacts of 6 years of his life from a metal box bolted to a cinder block wall. The thermos he had not used, the folded windbreaker, a pair of work gloves, a small package of throat lozenges, a photograph of Imani at age 9 taped to the inside of the door that he had forgotten was there. And on the top shelf, face down, the frame photograph of a younger man in a flight suit standing beside an F-14 Tomcat on the deck of the USS Enterprise. Calvin took the photograph down. He turned it over. He looked at it for the first time in 3 years. The man in the picture had his face turned away from the camera. You couldn't see his eyes. You couldn't see his smile if he was smiling. He was 29 years old. He had a wife at home in Norfolk and a mother in Tulsa who was going to call him that Sunday and ask him if he was eating enough. He had no children yet. He did not yet know that he would have a daughter, or what her name would be, or that she would one day stand in the second row of a ballroom in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and watch her father walk out from behind a curtain in a suit that fit him. Calvin looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he placed it carefully in the cardboard box on top of the folded windbreaker. He closed the locker for the last time. He did not lock it. There was no longer any reason to. He carried the cardboard box out of the locker room and across the hangar floor. The night shift mechanics nodded at him as he passed. Reggie Pruitt was at his security booth by the side door. Reggie stood up when Calvin walked by. He did not say anything. He held the door open. Calvin walked out into the cold November night. The sleet from 3 weeks earlier was a memory. The sky was clear. There were stars over the airfield. He put the box in the passenger seat of his truck. He started the engine. He pulled out of the parking lot and turned north onto Memorial Drive. He drove home to his daughter. 6 months later, on a clear morning in May, Calvin Foster walked his daughter onto the tarmac of Brennan Aviation's Flight Academy for her first solo flight as a student cadet under the Foster Initiative, the program he had built and named after some persuading from Imani in honor of her mother. Reggie Pruitt watched from the fence line at the edge of the apron in the same security uniform he had worn for 9 years, and when Imani's Cessna 172 left the ground and banked east into the morning sun, Reggie put his hand to his forehead in the unhurried, careful salute of a man who had once been a soldier and had never stopped being one. The framed photograph of Calvin beside the F-14 hung now not in a locker on a cinder block wall, but in the entrance lobby of the Academy building, beside a small bronze plaque with his name and his rank and 3 short words, "He came home so others could keep flying." Daniel Alcorn flew in from Atlanta for the dedication. So did Captain Lou Ferraro, and Captain Maria Velez, and Captain Tony Reyes. They stood in the lobby in their captain uniforms while Margaret Whitcomb said a few words, and then they did not stand on ceremony any longer. They took Calvin and Imani out to a barbecue place on the north side of Tulsa and ate ribs and talked for 4 hours about people they had loved and lost and remembered. On the anniversary of Cheryl's death the following spring, Calvin stood in his kitchen at 6:23 in the morning and brewed 2 cups of coffee. He drank the first one slowly by the window, watching the light come up over the back fence. He set the second cup on the kitchen table and let it sit there, untouched, until it had gone cold. And for the first time in 5 years, he did not apologize to anyone, not to Cheryl, not to himself, not to the empty chair across the table, for letting it grow cold. He simply sat with it, and he understood finally what it meant to keep a promise to someone you loved, by going on living the way they had wanted you to live. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that the quietest people in the room are sometimes carrying the most, please subscribe our channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there, someone is still pushing a mop in a hangar, raising a child alone, and waiting for the world to remember who they were before life asked them to become invisible. They deserve to be seen. So do you.